Nice.
All right. Okay, we are recording. All right, we're going to be on page 117. We finished chapter 9 last week, and my plan is to make some tracks on chapter 10. It's one of those chapters, and I think that the chapters here on out are going to be ones that we can move a little quicker through, because I don't know that there's that much picking apart and deconstruction we need to do, but we'll see how it goes. Hello, Ellen. Good to see you. And let's see.
I'm kind of glad you guys started late because I just got home and
see. Well, actually, we were waiting for you.
Well, that's nice, but
yeah, and we were waiting for Carol too, because she came on and then like that she were gone. So welcome back, Carol. I don't think she can hear us, however. Carol, can you hear us?
Where is she?
Okay. Doesn't look like she can hear us. I will text her.
Danielle's here. Hey, Danielle.
Hi, Danielle. Can you hear us? She's messing with us, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But I don't know that...
Yes, I am.
Yes. Okay, she's gone again. So Carol's having some technical difficulties. Okay, so before we dive in, anything? Tony got his one question out of his chest earlier. Anyone else have anything they want to bring up before we dive into chapter 10?
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10, page 117.
Woo, woo.
Yeah, Jerry's not been here. I wonder, did she already leave to go back east again? I don't know.
Yeah, I couldn't remember.
Yeah, because she's got the Kindle, and so I'm always trying to get her synced up, but I haven't had to do that recently. Okay, A Bright Sadness, chapter 10, page 117. Got a little epigraph there. I die by brightness and the Holy Spirit. Yeah, riddle me that one, right? Thomas Merton. And it comes from the Blessed Virgin Mary compared to a window. So there you go. Nice stuff, right?
Is that a book?
What's that?
Is that a book?
It's more of a published essay, but yes, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, there is a gravitas in the second half of life, but it is now held up by a much deeper lightness or okayness. Our mature years are characterized by a kind of bright sadness and a sober happiness. So yeah, I didn't give us a run up here. So we just finished the chapter on a second simplicity. So he was going through and talking about that we start in simplicity as children. We grow into complexity in the first half of life. The first half of life is characterized by complexity, lots of diversity, lots of moving pieces, lots of machinery, all the stuff, all the keys we got to have, all the balloons that we got to carry around. And then as we cross over into the second half of life, things start getting simpler until we finally reach a second simplicity, or as he calls it, a second naivete, but we're basically getting back to the garden. So now in these last chapters, he's characterizing what the person in the second half of life looks like. So it's kind of like the Beatitudes for Jesus. The Beatitudes, as I put it right at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, were his picture of the finished product. This is what the finished product is going to look like when you finally are a citizen of kingdom, when you are living kingdom in your life. This is what you're going to look like. So you got Rohr here starting to give us a picture of what the second half of life person looks like. Okay, so there's a gravitas in the second half of life, but it is now held up by a much deeper lightness or okayness. Our mature years are characterized by a kind of bright sadness and a sober happiness, if that makes any sense. I'm just grabbing for words to describe many wonderful older people I have met. If you have met them, you know for yourself, and you will find your own words. There is still darkness in the second half of life, in fact, maybe even more. But there is now a changed capacity to hold it creatively and with less anxiety. Anyone got a clue what the heck he's talking about here in this first paragraph? What's this light sadness or bright sadness and sober happiness? Our mature years are characterized by a kind of bright sadness and a sober happiness. And this isn't just because you get a lot of years under your belt. It's if you get a lot of years under your belt and you've done the work, because a lot of people just get older. They don't get wiser, right? And I think they're all in the checkout line at Albertsons, in Marion's checkout line in Albertsons, unfortunately. But yeah, there's a lot of, and he talks about this, you know, the sad case of the elder who is not an elder, just got older. But in terms of bright sadness and a sober happiness, he's gonna develop it a bit more. But I think for me, and see if this works for you, I think where he's driving toward is a conviction of having purpose and meaning in the sadness. So it's, as we get to the second half of life, and as he starts to develop what this person is like, there is a conviction of meaning and purpose and identity infused from the inside out in this person's life. So the sadness that is encountered, because being in the second half of life doesn't mean life's going to get any easier. It doesn't. It's just the same. But our ability to see purpose in it, to see how in another book he said everything belongs, that there is a place for that sadness. There's a necessary sadness and suffering. And to have purpose, that changes everything. It makes it doable. It even makes it noble, makes it virtuous. And so I think that's what he means by a bright sadness. It's still the difficulties of life, but now they're infused with this sense of meaning and purpose. They're infused with the task within the task. So even within the sadness or the difficulties that we're facing, we can see that there's another task that is inside of that, and a necessary thing to go through. And then the idea of sober happiness, I think, is understanding the limits of happiness or the transitory nature of happiness. And so we appreciate it, we're present to it, but we kind of understand that it's transitory. It's going to be moving back and forth. So that idea of having a sober happiness, we're not going to get all giddy and think that this is the be all and end all of everything because we have a good day like we did when we were young. You know, it's going to be almost a leveling process, you know, that goes through. So I think that's where he's driving. Makes sense to me. But let's see. It is what John of the Cross called luminous darkness. And it explains the simultaneous coexistence of deep suffering and intense joy in the saints, which would be impossible for most of us to even imagine. So here, once again, here's all this paradoxical language from the mystics, right? John of the Cross, you got luminous darkness, simultaneous deep suffering and intense joy in the saints, which would be impossible for most of us to even imagine. Eastern Orthodoxy believed that if something was authentic religious art, it would always have a bright sadness to it. I think I agree with them. And I'm saying the same thing of life itself. Sadness with purpose, okay? Meaning. We know how this sadness fits into life and where it's leading us. And that makes it bright in that sense. In the second half of life, one has less and less need or interest in eliminating the negative or fearful, making again those old rash judgments, holding on to old hurts, or feeling any need to punish other people. Your superiority complexes have gradually departed in all directions. You do not fight these things anymore. They have just shown themselves too many times to be useless, ego-based, counterproductive, and often entirely wrong. You learn to positively ignore and withdraw your energy from evil or stupid things rather than fight them directly. That's a great last line, right? You learn to positively ignore or withdraw your energy from rather than fight directly. That's a great way of putting, I think, where we go later on in life. You fight things only when you are directly called and equipped to do so. We all become a well-disguised mirror image of anything that we fight too long or too directly. That which we oppose determines the energy and frames the questions after a while. You lose all your inner freedom. This is a really important point, this paragraph. We all become well-disguised mirror images of anything that we fight too long or too directly. That is so true. Whether it's politics, whether it's religion or anything. If we are just against something, we end up taking on the mirror image of exactly what we're fighting, because that's what we're focused on. You know the old story of the grandfather telling the grandson that there's two wolves inside of him, a good wolf and a bad wolf, and they're constantly fighting. And the boy asks, which one wins? He says, the one that I feed. It's the same thing here. If you're going to feed, if you're going to be putting all your energy into opposing the thing that you are against, that's what becomes huge in your life, and you become that mirror image. You see that over and over again. And I think in our political discourse and in our religious discourse in our society, we're seeing that those on the opposite side of the fence are really the same person. They just are wearing different uniforms. There's nothing different about them. Their mindset is the same. They just have a different set of values that they are for and against. The only one who's really different is the one who's in liminal space with a foot in both camps. He says, by the second half of life, you have learned ever so slowly and with much resistance that most frontal attacks on evil just produce another kind of evil in yourself, along with a very inflated self-image to boot, and incites a lot of pushback from those you have attacked. This seems to be one of the last lessons to be learned. Think of the cold Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov, or the monk who tries to eliminate all humor in the name of the rose, or the frowning Quran burners of Florida. Holier than thou people usually end up holier than nobody. Not bad. And I would put into the same category those who are always fighting Satan, fighting demons. It's the same kind of idea. If you're constantly in a state of spiritual warfare, then that is what is defining you and defining your spiritual walk. And I think Paul says it perfectly. He says, hey, just pay no attention to all that stuff. Just focus on what is good. Focus on what is the Lord. Let everything else go.
I call them anger professionals, Dave.
That is perfect, Kathy. Spoken like a true HR veteran. Anger professionals. That's great. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on where he's going with all this?
I don't know where the verse is, but on the page before this, when he was talking about bright sadness, I can't hold my phone and turn the page at the same time. The deep suffering, coexistence of deep suffering and intense joy in the saints, which would be impossible for most of us to imagine. I didn't say it at that time, and now you've gone on to the next thoughts, but isn't there a verse, and I think it's maybe I don't remember where it is, but talks about these light and momentary struggles that we have are nothing compared to the weight of glory. Does that ring a bell?
It does,
No?
but I'm not placing the address either. Yeah,
it was really important to me early when I was, first dealing with Ryan's accident. And I just thought these light and momentary, there was nothing light or momentary about it. But I heard a message on that verse, and it was really about learning to see it through the eyes of what there's a bigger glory. There's a bigger purpose, I suppose, in all of the things that we find ourselves maybe thinking are going to overwhelm us. So maybe with the second half of life, we get to a point where we can, no matter how big or ominous the darkness feels, that we can trust that there is something much greater to be joyful in, even if we don't know it yet. But there's just that sense of, I've lived it, I've watched this happen, I've seen good and light come out of the darkness, and I know that it's almost cyclical. And maybe I diverted us from where we were at.
No, I don't think so. And I think for me, it keeps coming back to having a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning in everything. And if we can see that, then it changes everything. I was just talking to a woman today who's trying to decide whether to leave her husband or not. you know, because she caught him having an emotional affair. At least she thinks it's just emotional. You know, do you forgive? Do you carry on? Do you just end it all? I mean, what's the deal here? And you know, the bottom line that I was trying to get across to her is that, you know, there is no right or wrong answer here. She was looking for some kind of way of making the decision easier for her. But whatever she decides, if she conducts herself with integrity and honesty, she is going to learn things. There's going to be a deepening transition in her that is going to serve her for the rest of her life, whatever decision she makes. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. I know my divorce, as painful as it was the catalyst for everything that has followed. You know, it was pain enough to finally cut through all of the noise and distraction and self-delusion and everything of my 20s and early 30s to finally get my attention to start asking better questions and have the will to try to find something. And so if we can see how even the painful things in life have that ability to cut through the chaff and get us right to the incision point, then it makes a huge difference in the way we approach them. And we can see that they still belong. They still have a place in life, a necessary place in life. And I think that's what creates the brightness to the sadness, or the luminousness to the darkness, is because we're looking at these things in a different way and we're seeing the task within the task. And that is such a second half of life point of view, because the first half of life can only see it as a failure, can only see it as a blockage, only a frustration of goals and outcomes that are necessary for happiness. First half of life sees circumstances as bringing happiness and fulfillment. Second half of life understands that we bring happiness and fulfillment to the circumstances. And that's a very different proposition. Okay, let's do a little more. Wait, go ahead.
Can I add on page 117, the first one, it says a bright sadness over happiness. I was thinking more because I joined this fellowship and I'm one of the youngest ones. Not that I'm young, but they're somewhere in their 70s and 80s. But in the, wait.
What happened there?
What happened? Time for a short commercial break.
I'm sorry. In the interim, 3 people have died already. 2 of pancreatic cancer, and 1 Papa Neil. I don't know what he died of, but he was in his 80s. So I think as we get older, the way I interpret it too is that many of our friends, my siblings, my cousins, will be dying too. And I don't want to be the one left alone. That's my sadness. And but even though there's the next generation, but they're younger, it's a different dynamic too. And there's no, anyway, so it reminds me to another poem I read in college. It's called The Cherry Trees. I don't know if you're familiar, but A.E. Housman, he says, in my life, I will only see 80 times of these cherry blossoms. And he's nearing, I guess, he's saying the 5 more times I'm going to see, it has to be cherished because there's 5 more springs, 5 more cherry blossoms. And so that's what it reminds me of. The joy of seeing it, and it's very limited.
Kind of a bittersweet quality is what I hear you saying, Ellen. You know, we know that the time is finite, and yet that makes it even more precious. And so we have a brightness to the sadness. I like that.
Yeah.
That's great. And the same thing with your friends, as they start dropping off, it just reminds you to be so much more present to the ones that are still sitting around the table with you, right? And it creates a brightness to the sadness. So, and these are all very second half of life insights, observations, realities. And so he's painting this picture. After we've gone through this whole book of trying to understand the difference between first and second half of life on more of a theoretical kind of idea and the necessary suffering that is the transition between the two. Well, what do we get at the end? What does it look like? Well, this is the picture that he's trying to paint for us. Okay, let's read a little more. Daily life now requires prayer and discernment more than knee-jerk responses toward either the conservative or liberal end of the spectrum. You have a spectrum of responses now, and they're not just all predictable, as is too often the case with most knee-jerk responses. Law is still necessary, of course, but it is not your guiding star, or even close. It has been wrong and cruel too many times. Now here's Jesus in Matthew 5, redefining the law, right? It's not the monolithic, absolute anymore. He's saying, no, your ethics are still situational. Here's the law, here's the general guide, but you still have to bring your whole self to it, to every situation, and make your choices based on that, from the inside out, what love requires. And so I think it's the same thing here. It's not about knee-jerk responses. It's not just about what's lawful and unlawful anymore. It's not just about what the rules, the one-size-fits-all blanket that we're going to put down on everything. There's a whole spectrum of responses. There's so many different ways that we go based on actually being present and to understand and discern what is being asked of us. What does the situation really require? And what is the most loving response? Sometimes it's to actually break the code of the law in order to be loving in a given situation, or break your own code that you have worked so hard to build up in your mind and realize it doesn't apply here. And are we willing to do that? Because that's scary. That kind of messes with our heads. But that's what second half of life is all about. It's knowing when to color outside the lines. So if we spend the first half of life learning the rules, we're going to spend the second half of life knowing how to break them to actually provide what love requires. He says the 8 Beatitudes speak to you much more than the 10 Commandments now. I love that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the Beatitudes are not laws. The Beatitudes are statements of being. And if you are that way, if you really are poor in spirit, if you really are pure in heart, if you really are a peacemaker, that's going to direct your actions in a way that is going to look like law sometimes, but it's always going to look like love. And so this is the idea here. In the second half of life, it's going to be about the Beatitudes. It's not going to be about the 10 Commandments. I've always wondered why people never want to put a stone monument of the 8 Beatitudes on the courthouse lawn. Then I realized that the 8 Beatitudes of Jesus would probably not be very good for any war, any macho worldview, the wealthy, or our consumer economy. Now, he's kind of setting up a straw man here, something that's really easy to knock down. But the truth of the matter is that Jesus' actual teachings and the Beatitudes would be anarchy if we tried to actually use them to order a society around, because they are micro tools. They're not macro instruments. And that's the thing that we have to understand. The law is for the macro. That's why we still need it. That's why Jesus said, I'm not here to abolish the law. And not one jot or tittle is going to be left unfulfilled, but it's going to be fulfilled in this way from the inside out, this way of the law of love, which James called the law of liberty, right? So yes, it would be anarchy if we tried to apply the 8 Beatitudes on the courthouse lawn. And that's not just a bad thing. It's not that the Beatitudes are somehow against war, macho worldview, the wealthy consumer economy. Our very functioning of society, our very function of community life depends on rules. There has to be rules. There has to be a law. But within those rules that we're using for the group to be able to continue to exist and survive, we as individuals need to be applying the Beatitudes and applying our presence to make our personal decisions inside the larger grouping of the law in the macro sense. Both have to work seamlessly together. Courthouses are good and necessary first half of life institutions. Okay, he's saying the same thing. In the second half, you try instead to influence events, work for change, quietly persuade, change your own attitude, pray or forgive instead of taking things to court. Life is much more spacious now. The boundaries of the container having been enlarged by the constant addition of new experiences and relationships. You're like an expandable suitcase, and you became so almost without your noticing. This is a huge point. You're like an expandable suitcase, and you became so almost without noticing. And the reason this is so important is if we approach the transition to the second half of life with a focus toward the outcome, with a constant measurement of how we're progressing and how we're doing and how we're changing, if that's our focus, it's like going on a diet and stepping on the scale every half hour to see if you've lost any weight, then you are actually applying first half rules and mindset to what is supposed to be the second half of life journey, and you're cooked before you begin. If we're really on the second half of life journey, we are so immersed in the now that we're not paying attention to the outcome. We're invested in a process, not in the outcome. And so we don't notice when the change is taking place. As I've said so many times, others will notice the change in you before you notice the change in yourself. Or you'll walk into a situation that just yanked your chain a couple months ago, and it doesn't even raise your blood pressure. And you realize you have changed while you weren't looking, while you were just living and paying attention. And so you're like an expandable suitcase, and you became so almost without your noticing. Now you are just here, and here holds more than enough. Such here-ness, however, has its own heft, authority, and influence. Just watch true elders sitting in any circle of conversation. They are often defining the center, depth, and circumference of the dialogue just by being there. Most participants do not even know it is happening. When elders speak, they need very few words to make their point. Too many words, the use of which I am certainly guilty, are not needed by true elders. Second simplicity has its own kind of brightness and clarity, but much of it is expressed in nonverbal forms and only when really needed. If you talk too much or too loud, you are usually not an elder. And that's bringing to mind, preach the gospel continuously, use words where necessary, right? Same type of idea. Man, it would be great if some of our politicians could learn this, right? Imagine a true elder politician, one who didn't have to say so many words. Wow. If we know anything at this stage, we know that we are all in this together, and that we are all equally naked underneath our clothes, which probably does not feel like a whole lot of knowing, but even this little bit of honesty gives us a strange and restful consolation. When you are young, you define yourself by differentiating yourself. Now you look for the things that we all share in common. You find happiness in a likeness, which has become much more obvious to you now. And you do not need to dwell on the differences between people or exaggerate the problems. Creating dramas has become boring. I've said this several times, but though I would put it, I have put it in the past, was we try to make ourselves acceptable by making ourselves different. We try to make ourselves approved by making ourselves different and differentiating ourselves. But in the end, we realize that we're approved or loved because we're all the same. In God's love, we're loved because we're all the same. We're loved the same. And yet we spend our lives, at least the first half of life, trying to make ourselves different so that we can be noticed and approved and loved and revered and accepted and all those things. And it's just the opposite. Any thoughts? I'm honoring the silence, Danielle. How am I doing? I'll keep on, but cut in anytime you want. In the second half of life, it's good to be a part. It's good just to be a part of the general dance. We do not have to stand out, make defining moves, or be better than anyone else on the dance floor. Life is more participatory than assertive, and there is no need for strong or further self-definition. God has taken care of all of that, much better than we ever expected. The brightness comes from within now, and it is usually more than enough. The dance has a seriousness to it, but also an unself-conscious freedom of form that makes it bright and shining. Think of two old lovers quietly dancing to a soft clarinet and piano melody of the 1940s, safe and relaxed in one another's arms and unconcerned whether anyone is watching. The dance is completely for its own sake. At this stage, I no longer have to prove that I or my group is the best, that my ethnicity is superior, that my religion is the only one that God loves, or that my role and place in society deserves superior treatment. I am not preoccupied with collecting more goods and services. Quite simply, my desire and effort every day is to pay back, to give back to the world a bit of what I have received. I now realize that I have been gratuitously given to, from the universe, from society, and from God. I try now, as Elizabeth Seton said, to live simply so that others can simply live. As I was reading some of this, I got a sense, where he talks about, in the second half of life, it's good to be just a part of the general dance. We don't have to stand out, make defining moves, be better than anyone else on the dance floor. Well, when you think about it, Richard Rohr is saying this on the far end of a 50-year career where he's done all of that. He identifies as a type 1 on the Enneagram. Did you know that, William? Type 1. So he is driven, he's controlling, he's all those things. And he, carved out this world-renowned career, right? And so he's sitting on this position of fame. He's sitting on this position of success as the world would measure it, as the first half of life would measure it, right? And respect and all of that. And now he's saying that, he's gotten to the point where none of that matters, but he already has it. He's not going to lose it. He doesn't have to work as hard at it anymore. He's still writing books, of course, although I know he's backing off a lot. But what my next thought was, what if none of that was ever achieved? What if you get to this age in life and you haven't met all those goals? What if you're still just kind of the nobody in the first half of life parlance, right? Can we still find this attitude that Richard is talking about if we're not already sitting on top of the mountain? Can we then stop looking for differentiation if we haven't really differentiated ourselves from the crowd? Can we stop looking for distinction? Is it going to be harder to do, or is it going to be easier to do? But I think there's something there. I haven't really totally developed it in my own mind, but I wanted to throw it out to you because so many times authors and people who are successful in any discipline, they start giving the wisdom to the rest of us. But they're in this rarefied position, and we listen to them because they're in that rarefied position. But how many of the real elders are in positions like that? And can we respect those who have gotten to the place of wisdom in a second half of life understanding if they don't have a position like Richard Rohr? Are we going to still listen to them? Are we going to hear the truth in their life? Are we going to be happy in our second half of life experience if we still have things left undone, outcomes that we never achieved? Are we going to be able to be happy just being undifferentiated and go into this quieter place that Richard Rohr is talking about? Or are we going to see that as a lack of ambition still because we're making excuses for ourselves for not having achieved the things that we set out to achieve in our 20s and 30s?
I'm working with a client who was a football phenom, did really well in high school and got a full scholarship to University of Bakersfield. And in his freshman year, he got involved in a situation where he was accused of rape. Ended up taking a plea, which after he thought he was going to get community service or something along those lines. Anyhow, the judge kicked his charges up in the sentences. and had him register as a sex offender, et cetera, which, he had to do, I think, 3 months in prison, and then came out with this sex offender record, traveling, haunting him for the next 10 years, basically. So every job application, et cetera, that he filled out, he had to go through this whole background check and so on. Very much a spiritual guy, loves God, et cetera. But he basically feels like he hasn't achieved, basically he sees himself as a complete failure. Like he all of the expectations that his family and people around him had for him, he didn't live up to. And he has a really difficult time. Like, I was talking to him about some of the Richard Rohr stuff and some of the thoughts we have in this group. And it's just, it sounds good on paper, but there's just no traction for him because he's still stuck in this, like, basically his life stopped when he got the sex offender charge, and all the plans that he had for himself just kind of got derailed from there. And I'm struggling with how to wrap that in some bow of meaning that he could use. But yeah, I don't know exactly what to do with it at this point.
And that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about, William. For someone in that position, or really any of us who maybe didn't achieve, we didn't write the great American novel, or we didn't do, we didn't become a captain of industry. Maybe we don't even have enough money for a secure retirement. I mean, it can be anything, any of the above.
Right.
Are we going to be able to get to the place that Richard Rohr is talking about, where we realize that ultimately those things don't matter, that our actual purpose here as a human being on this planet has nothing to do with the accomplishments that we can achieve. That stuff all ends at the headstone. What is it that actually transcends that? What does continue with us? It's what we've learned through everything that we've done, however great or however small. It really doesn't matter. And on the other hand, for someone like Richard Rohr, I mean, Jesus said it's going to be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to get into the kingdom, because they're really invested in the status quo, aren't they? Their own and the society that lionizes and reveres them. And so is it going to be easier for someone like a Richard Rohr to be able to divest himself and realize that the things that really matter are not the dozens of books he's written or the reputation he has, but something that nobody will ever see? Or is it going to be someone like William's client who has been hamstrung, for the last 10 years? Is he going to be able, this is the kind of the question that was coming up in my mind as I was reading these paragraphs and thinking about where it's coming from the author's point of view.
And with this kid, like, he's watching Monday Night Football and he's seeing people that he used to play with in high school and college on television, and he is living this life of mediocrity. And I've tried in many different ways to kind of put a different coat of paint on that, and try to move him into this, like, what's his name, St. John of the Cross, like the dark night of the soul kind of thinking. And sometimes it takes root, but then, he has some other things going on. Like, he's the guy with the kid with muscular dystrophy and the wife muscular with multiple sclerosis.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, basically, he feels like God is just kicking him in the balls over and over and over again. And he doesn't know what to do with that. He's really pissed at God, basically. But he still has a relationship with God. He's still...
How old is he, William?
He just turned 40.
Okay. So he's right there in midlife crisis territory and everything. So yeah, everything's hitting at once. But you made an interesting comment. You said that he's living this life of mediocrity, but he's only living a mediocre life from a first half of life perspective. That's the hardest thing for us to be able to get our minds around, because we don't really realize how deep the rabbit hole goes, that first half of life rabbit hole. It is right at the roots and the foundation of who we all are. Just as human beings, because life is set up, physical life is a first half of life experience. We're really swimming against the current when we move into the second half of life. And all our institutions and our church and everybody else under the sun is filling us with first half of life values. And so we automatically are going to describe our lives as mediocre if we haven't achieved the kind of first half of life success that is what is being held out, as the carrot for all of us. And yet that ultimately has nothing to do with it. I mean, from a first half of life perspective, Jesus was a complete failure and led a mediocre life. He didn't really achieve that much, From a first half of life perspective, in fact, he kept working down the ladder of success. Every time someone tried to pump him up politically or in terms of any kind of temporal power, he wouldn't have it, And yet, look what he did have, and look what has endured. So it's so difficult. I mean, I think any one of us, if we were in William's client's position, would see ourselves as being less than and mediocre because of a situation that maybe partially we couldn't even control, especially with his child. But this is what the second half of life is trying to change in us. Whether we are on top of the mountain or whether we're under it, there's this leveling process. And I think that's what Solomon was trying to get at in Ecclesiastes. He said, it doesn't matter. Everybody dies. The fool and the wise man die. The saint and the sinner die. Everybody dies. Everything else is just chasing after the wind when it comes right down to it. Can we get to that point where we can start to see life that way so that we can relax and have the kind of free attitude that he's painting here as a characteristic of someone in the second half of life?
I have a question. Okay, so if the second half of life is more about spirituality than more the materialism of the first half, the same emotional and psychological issues that we have still carry from one to the other. So what I'm trying to say is where we're understanding a different way, a more spiritual view of our lives, where do we overcome, I guess, all of those traumatic experiences, the hurts that we carry over, the ones that don't allow us to be our full self or our actualized kind of self?
That's all happening in the process, if you're actually doing the process. I mean, the contemplative journey is kind of like being on the psychodynamic analyst couch, and you are really kind of going back to family of origin stuff. That's going to come bubbling up. You're going to become more and more aware in a cognitive behavioral sort of way of what the thought and behavior patterns that are driving you are doing and where they're coming from. And you start to tie all those things together. As you become more aware and more mindful, and you become more situational in your ethics, you're starting to regulate your emotions without really even knowing you're doing it. But if you can really be present to a situation and not just bring a blanket law or rule to bear on everything, but you say, now what is really going on here? What does this situation require? What do these people really need? How can I leave everybody better than I found them? Well, even if you're being triggered emotionally by all this, your awareness is allowing you to be able to regulate those emotions and get to the other side. You do that a few hundred times, and guess what? You've got a different whole network going on up there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm glad you said that, because that's what I'm experiencing. The more that we get into this, there are things that are coming up that were kind of like hurts and injuries of the past. And all of a sudden, these are starting to surface. The difference is that I'm looking at it more objectively, more neutral. You know, I'm not reacting, even though I recognize how these hurts have affected my life from young even to adulthood. But I think because of what we're doing here, I'm not reacting to it. It's not throwing me off. It's not dooms. Oh my God, no matter how hard I try, I keep, you know, there's still all this baggage. So
I'm so glad you brought this up, Tony, because this is exactly the experience. And what you're describing was my experience, 30 years ago as well. I think what happens when you start spending time in contemplative space, whether it's offline in meditation or centering prayer, whether it's online in mindful presence, you're thinning out the barrier between the unconscious and the conscious, and it becomes permeable. And all of these things that are trapped under there just start bubbling up like those mud pots in Yellowstone. They just kind of, and they don't surface during the times of prayer or during the times of meditation. They kind of happen randomly throughout the day. It's bizarre the way it works. I remember remembering things that I forgot from my childhood, and then seeing this bright line to, oh, that's why I think this, and that's why that hurts, and that's why I do X and Y, and starting to do my own kind of psychoanalysis. And then with mindfulness, I was able to do my own CBT, basically awareness and opposite action. I can be aware of a trigger that would normally cause me to do X. I'm going to take a breath and I'm going to do Y. It's amazing how this works. Now it's unguided, and it can be fraught with some peril, especially if you've got some real trauma back there. That starts coming up and there's no one to help guide you through it. That can be a little scary. That's why it's good to have a spiritual director while you're doing this, or to have a therapist while you're doing this as well. And the beautiful thing is that your contemplative practice and your therapy can just dovetail perfectly, unless you've got a screwy therapist, I suppose. But
yeah, well,
this is the process. And Tony, it sounds like you're right on it.
I had to come up with the things that have come up. I'm not going to get into detail about that, but the things that have come up really have to do kind of a little bit like with self-esteem and things like this, being worthy and all this. So I had to come up with some kind of analogy for me to explore this. And I've come up with this phrase, the boy who couldn't look in the mirror, as an analogy for me to go forward kind of with this exploration for myself.
That's great, buddy.
Right.
And I think if you understand that this is how it works, and this is what is supposed to be happening, and your emotional regulation or your healing from the trauma and the hurts that have kept you in more dysfunctional patterns before, this is the healing process. This is actually building the new neural pathways and the whole ball of wax. This is how it works. And then when something does come up, it's just like throwing up when you're sick. You hate to do it because it's so uncomfortable, but you feel better afterwards. So it's kind of like that when this stuff comes up, mnemonically or emotionally, and you really don't want it to, because it's going to hurt like hell, but you're going to feel better afterwards. As soon as you can put purpose in that pain, then it becomes another virtue and another noble act, and you can deal with it. The sadness becomes bright, as Richard Rohr would say.
Mm-hmm. I remember Russ Hudson from the Enneagram fame. He talked about this idea that most of us think of the enlightened person as like the Buddha sitting on the lotus flower in a serene place where he's not disturbed by anything. But another way to think of someone who is awake is someone who experiences everything, someone who feels things deeply, someone who has a full breadth of experience. So the more self-aware we become, the more, like you're describing there, Tony, like some of those painful things come to bear, and we don't have to run from them anymore. We can welcome them in and see what gifts they have to bring us.
And that's the basis of the welcoming practice, right? You're triggered by a strong negative emotion. You stop, you acknowledge it, you lean into it, you sit with it, you welcome it, because it's going to give you the gift that William's talking about if you handle it correctly, if you don't run from it, stuff it, repress it, but actually play through. And then you say the affirmations that you need that allow you to come back to presence again. And you do that again a few hundred times. And guess what? That particular emotion is no longer your trigger. But there's no substitute for actually going through this on a repetitive basis. We have to do it and do it over and over again until it becomes muscle memory. And the muscle memory, or the procedural memory, is the healing. That is the healing, right? When we've created these new neural pathways that are now sound and functional, and that's our new normal that we gravitate around, that's a whole different trip. And that's where the healing comes from. But that's why we actually have to do something. We can't just think about it or pray about it. You know, that gives us the strength, that shows us the door or shows us the task within the task, but then we actually have to do it and do it over and over and over again.
But you can't measure it with the tape measure, you know, your progress.
No, don't work that way. Let's read just a couple more paragraphs and then we're gonna, boy, this time went fast. He says, Erik Erikson calls someone at this stage a generative person, one who is eager and able to generate life from his or her own abundance and for the benefit of following generations. Because such people have such a good container, they are able to contain more and more truth, more and more neighbors, more and broader vision, more and more of a mysterious and outpouring God. And so that container is the egoic container, right, of the first half of life is what he's talking about. Their God is no longer punitive, or tribal. They once worshipped their raft, right? Just as Odysseus worshipped his oar, they worshiped their raft. Now they love the shore where it has taken them. They once defended signposts. Now they've arrived where the signs pointed. They now enjoy the moon instead of fighting over whose finger points to it most accurately, quickly, or definitively. One's growing sense of infinity and spaciousness is no longer found just out there, but most especially in here. The inner and the outer have become one. You can trust your inner experience now, because even God has allowed it, used it, received it, and refined it. As St. Augustine dramatically put it in his Confessions, you were within, but I was without. You were with me, but I was not with you. So you called, you shouted, you broke through my deafness, you flared, blazed, and banished my blindness. You lavished your fragrance, and I gasped. And it's a beautiful passage there, but I also want to point out that it may not always be experienced the way that this seems to be talking about the experience. Sometimes it's not this huge, you know, mountaintop peak experience. It's not loud. It's more like Elijah, who, you know, the Lord was not in the earthquake, the Lord was not in the fire, the Lord was not in the wind, but there's this soft blowing at the back of the cave, and he puts on his mantle and goes out to meet his Lord. Sometimes it's quiet, but you'll still gasp, you know, at the audacity of it. But don't always be looking for the spectacular, because it may not be that way. It wasn't for me anyway. I can only speak for myself. You know, my encounters with this kind of presence have been a lot quieter than that and more gradual than that. And that's okay too. Thank God for Thomas Keating, who wrote it in An Invitation to Love, that it didn't have to be that spectacular thing, you know, because I was feeling like I was living a spiritually mediocre life, because I hadn't had this kind of what I assumed. Who knows what Augustine really meant by that or what he actually experienced. But I assumed from that it's this big, huge thing that I always want. I wanted a burning bush. Come on, can't I just have one burning bush, for crying out loud? You know, what I could do with one burning bush. Alas. All right, we should probably go ahead and stop there, because there's another 2 or 3 pages for the end of the chapter, but we did pretty well.
You want to figure out the holiday schedule before we call it?
Yeah. So Kathy has already told us that she's bailing on us next week. So
Just me.
Next Thursday is Thanksgiving. Look at Danielle's horrified face. Aren't you used to me by now yet, Danielle? How long have we been banging around together? 12 years or something? And I can still get that look on your face? That's pretty cool, actually.
No, that was in response to Kathy ditching us.
Oh, good.
No.
Thanks, Kathy. All right. So anyway, yeah, Kathy's got everybody coming in for Thanksgiving, which is next Thursday. So what do you guys want to do? We always take the last 2 weeks of the year off. You know, I had promised by hook or crook we were going to finish this book by then, but we're running out of Wednesdays. So we'll have to see what we can do. This Wednesday would be the day before Thanksgiving. So that's kind of a tough day for a lot of you who may be preparing, you know, for the next day and stuff. What do you all want to do? Do you want to take the whole week off? Do you want to try to meet Tuesday and take Wednesday off? What would you like to do? Any thoughts?
I can do either one.
Either one, what? Either both or one?
Tuesday or Wednesday, whatever works.
Okay. Okay. I'm good. I can still do Wednesday, you know, because actually our Thanksgiving is going to end up being Saturday. So it doesn't make no never mind to me. But if there's some of you who'd really rather not, we can take a break.
How many people will miss next week?
Kathy, Jordana? And Scott. Scott, is that both days or just Wednesday?
I'll be gone Wednesday, and I don't know how early I'll be back Wednesday night.
Okay, so you'll be gone Wednesday, but you'll be here Tuesday?
I can be here Tuesday.
Okay. Well, it looks like the most of us can do it. So let's just carry on. We'll record. I'll remember to record even without Kathy here, so you can watch it and catch up with us, and we can keep knocking stuff out, because if I don't get this book done by the end of the year, I'm going to really be in hot water.
Well, we still have some weeks in December coming up, a few before the holiday. So.
Yeah, we do. In fact, let's see if we take a look.
2 weeks in December, though. So
what's that?
We only have 2 weeks in December, so we're not.
Actually, we have 3. So
3?
Yeah. So if today is what? Today is 16, and so we're going to obviously. What am I doing here? The 24th. So we'll have 2 more weeks in November and 3 weeks. So we got 5 weeks before we take our last 2 weeks off. So I think we can finish the book in.
We're gonna finish for sure.
Yeah.
What did you decide though? Tuesday or Wednesday next week?
We're going to do both. We'll do Tuesday and Wednesday.
Oh.
And just everybody go ahead and show up for what you can. You know, it may be a little thin, but you know, we'll get a quorum and we'll make it a party. What can I tell you? So. Okay. All right.
Just record so I can listen.
I will make sure we record. Absolutely. Someone help remind me, you know, to do this.
Because Scott won't be here and he's my backup. So Danielle, you're on.
Right. Okay, Danielle, you be my nudge, okay? All right. Okay, Scotty, close us in prayer, would you?
Father God, we're so blessed to be here together with you and your company, and having the pleasure of spending time with each other, encouraging each other, and exploring and searching, and just trying to touch bases with each other to make sure we're all on a good track. This second half of life thing can be complicated, Lord. I pray that you unfold it for us in a way that helps us to put it to good use and to honor you in all the choices that we make with our careers, our lives, and our families, and the world you gave us to live in. We're ever so grateful, God, for your love and your encouragement. We pray all this and give our thanks in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen. All right, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. See you Sunday.
Okay.
All right, guys.
Good night. Good night, everybody.
Good night, guys.
Bye.
Good night. Good night. Yeah, Frank Defied. Good night to you if you're even there, and Jordana and Linda. See you guys Saturday and Sunday.
Okay.
Okay.
See you guys then.
Bye.